Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Shine Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Shine Hills at shinehills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
We are across the street and around the world, Cheyenne Hills.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our March through Genesis. But before we get to Genesis, I got a quiz for you, Ken. This is cold because I didn't prepare you for any of this. Okay, so today it's not going to be aired on Cinco de Mayo, but we are recording this on Cinco de Mayo. Okay. So can you tell us what Cinco de Mayo means?
Means the 5th of May for a short answer.
So why do we celebrate? Why is it celebrated, especially by the Mexicans? This is a big celebration.
I didn't know much. I assumed it was independence of Mexico from Spain, but that's not accurate.
Well, actually, what happened, and the only reason we know this is because our producer actually Googled it, and we all know now. Actually, he knew the answer. He just needed to confirm it. But it was Mexico fought a battle against France. France and Britain and Spain had come to an alliance. This is according to our Google expert over there behind the soundboard. But an alliance against Mexico because Mexico had a debt to pay. Okay, and so Mexico actually beat apparently France. So France is the main one, and so they beat France, and that was it wasn't necessarily independence, but it was a big battle. So the celebration that Mexico, at least now, I don't know if you go to the man on the street and he knows this stuff. I didn't, but this is according to via Google. So there you go.
Okay.
Now you know.
Interesting historical.
I got to throw one more at you because now this actually sort of ties to Genesis. Okay. When I say John Walvoord, what comes to mind?
Former president of Dallas Seminary.
Okay. Tell me, what else do you remember about Walvoord? Now, was he president when you were there?
Yes.
Okay. He was chancellor when I was there.
Okay. No, he was still active president when I was there, and he was actually teaching classes too. And of course, a lot of his big forte was Revelation and end times eschatology.
Right. And it's perfect lead in because when I was there, he was the first guy that spoke to the incoming freshmen that year, and I didn't know him. I didn't know anybody. The only person I knew of was Chuck Swindoll because I listened to him on the radio and I knew he went to Dallas Seminary. But all the other famous people, I didn't realize how famous they were until I really started reading their books, and it was like, wow, this guy's a giant. Walvoord is a giant, especially when it comes to eschatology. And it does tie into Genesis, so hang on out there. But Walvoord said, it was the first address that he made to us. And just so you know, this was in 1989. And when I got there, that's when the first Gulf War started. Okay. And so it's like everybody was thinking, wow, this is the end, right? This is the last, this is back close to Babylon, this whole thing. And Walvoord was actually called on by most, if not all, of the news outlets at that time, the major ones, in New York. And he was on all the time they're asking the question, is this the big one? And he had written a book called Armageddon, Oil Crisis in the Middle East. And his whole thesis in that book, and that was years before this happened, his whole thesis in that book is that oil would actually drive everybody back to Babylon, back to that area. Okay. And he was spot on. He wrote that book. I wish I had it in front of me. I'm pretty sure it was in the 60s, and he wrote that. And they actually updated it a couple times since then and added some more to it. But anyway, here's what Walvoord said. The first thing I remember him saying that struck me, and he was a mountain of a man. He was probably 6'4", 5".
Pretty.
Wouldn't you say?
Tall man, yeah. Big.
And impressive, and real kind of a gentle giant. Real soft, I would say soft-spoken. Yeah. But when he spoke, it was a big boom. You could tell that was the boom that you were listening for. Yeah. But he said he believes that the reason that America is prosperous is because we bless Israel. That was the first thing I remember him saying, and I just hit me like, what? And so. But, throughout unpacking eschatology and understanding the Abrahamic covenant, which is we're going to see God reinstate or remind Abram of the Abrahamic covenant, the promise that God made to Abraham. Now, what we learned in seminary is of all the covenants, this was an unconditional covenant. In other words, God is the one that wrote this, and the way He wrote it is He slaughtered the animals. You can help me out here because I'm kind of going. But there's an ox and a lamb and some pigeons, and he split them, and then a pot of fire, right, passed through them, and saying that this will be a covenant between you and me. And the covenant was written so that if Abram failed, God wouldn't, right?
Yeah, as I recall, the traditional way of doing that, the blood covenant was that both parties would walk between the severed halves.
Right.
But in this case,
it was just God.
God put Abraham to sleep, or Abraham saw it in a vision, and it's only God that walks between, because He is the one that's going to keep the covenant.
He's not relying on man to keep his half, at least on this covenant. There was other covenants like the Mosaic covenant that was the conditional, but this one was unconditional because God wrote it and is signed it in His own hand, so to speak, right?
Yep.
And so what God said to Abram is that you're going to be a great nation. You're going to have multiple, more descendants than the sands of the seashore, and you're going to have this land. All right. And so we just saw in Genesis chapter 13, we saw Abram and Lot separate. Now, Abram was supposed to leave all of his family, and he didn't. He took Lot with him. That was his nephew. And they started having quarrels between their herdsmen, and so they divided the land. And Abram said, listen, Lot, you take whichever land you want to take. And so he took the valley. He took the fertile valley. I think it was drop dead gorgeous, green, and lush and fertile at that time, and it is not today, but at that time, which is around the Dead Sea now, and he chose that area, and so Abram said, all right, I'll take everything else. And so after that separation of the herds and the people and all those things, and their servants, this is what happened. This is Genesis chapter 13, verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I gave it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now, the oaks of Mamre, to me, it's south of Jerusalem. You had some insight on this, actually.
Well, it was just I was talking about where you teach that course on Bible study methods, and the first method is observation.
Yeah,
and I read through the Bible a couple times, and I preached it and taught it, but I always thought the Mamre was just a geographic location.
Right. I did too until you said this.
And reading the Bible, especially as we get into chapter 14, verse 13, it's like Mamre is an actual person.
So oaks were his oaks. Everybody knew the oaks of Mr. Jones or whatever.
Yeah, and maybe it was because he planted them. Maybe he's like, hey, I'm going to bring up a forest and sell the timber.
Yeah, could be.
Who knows? Who knows? But anyway.
That's where he settled, and that was a part of. And so now the other thing I want to kind of clarify, or at least talk about, I don't know if we'll clarify it today, but when God gave this land, it was a bigger land than just the land of Israel we see today. It went all the way to the Fertile Crescent, the way I understand it, which would be the river Euphrates, all on the north. Mm-hmm. Of course, Mediterranean on the west. On the south would be, I think, probably the Red Sea. All right. Now, the eastern boundary, I'm always fuzzy on. I would say clear down the Fertile Crescent. Go ahead. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I don't know on that eastern boundary where. But it fell.
When he looked as far as I could see, I know that if you stand on that ridge of mountains just out east of Jerusalem and west of Jericho, you can see there's the big mountain of Moab, which is in Jordan.
Oh my God.
Yeah, right. And you can see that. You can also stand up in the Golan Heights on that ridge, and look out. And you can, if you have knew where you're looking, you can see Damascus, and that's up in Syria. Yeah. So the scope of this land is way bigger. We can at least say that. I'm not sure exactly what the boundaries are, but we can say this: it's way bigger than what they have today.
Yeah.
Right. And they keep trading land for peace, and that does never really worked out so well for them. But so anyway, God said, "I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you a people, a land, a seed, and a blessing. The seed are the people. The blessing is, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." And that's an unconditional covenant that God gave. Now, the reason I say all that is because that actually affects our politics, if you want to call it that, because it affects what we think about Israel, right? You can jump in here anytime you want, but this is basically, I'll just speak for myself. The reason that I believe we are to bless Israel is because I believe the Abrahamic covenant is still alive and well. I believe it's an unconditional covenant. Now, granted, not every Christian or every Christian tradition believes that. Some think that the church has replaced Israel and that covenant is no longer. The way that Walford and the way that you and I got our teeth cut on this end times things is that God still has a plan for Israel, and the church is a parenthetical. It's the bride, if you will, and Israel is called the wife. There's two different plans that God has: one for Israel, one for the church, and that's part of what shapes our theology and our politics.
Yeah, and Romans 9 and 10 really seems to reinforce this.
Right.
People who hold to that the church has replaced Israel tend to look at it as well as a spiritual thing, but
right.
There's the spiritual aspect. That we are in the faith of Abraham when we are believers,
right?
But still, the ethnic line still continues, and Romans 9 and 10 seem to make that clear. That
right.
Paul talks about his kinsmen according to the flesh,
right.
and that God's going to restore them.
Right.
So it's
9, 10, and 11 actually, because that root, which is Israel, the natural branches are cut off, and we, the wild olive shoots, are grafted in, and that very clearly, that wild olive shoot, that's Gentiles, that's the church age, and he said you shouldn't be arrogant, because if God remove the natural branches because of their disobedience, he will also remove you if you don't obey and remain grafted, if you will. But the root is not the church; the root is Israel.
Yeah.
And I think those are things that really drive the narrative, at least for those of us that look through that particular lens. And there's a lot of seminaries that do that, look at that dispensational view. It's like we don't buy into this replacement theology. Lots of great Bible teachers do, though. It's it's an interesting thing to me. I don't know if I fully understand why. I look at some of these passages and it seems so obvious to me, but I think you hit on it. If you spiritualize it, that's how you have to get there. You have to have a spiritual Israel and not a literal Israel. Yeah.
And, like I've said, it Romans 9, 10, and 11, it really, he seems explicitly to say they are the kinsmen according to the flesh. The physical Jews will be the ones that will inherit the actual geographic land of Israel.
It's interesting to me, and we should count this up, but how many times God reminds Abram of the Abrahamic covenant? We know the first time he says it in 9:6, I believe, and he tells Abram, "I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be blessed. I'm going to bless you through it." And then he reminds him again, and then here again we see it one more time. The Lord said to Abram, after he'd separated, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are northward and southward and east and west, for all the land that you see I will give to you, you and your offspring forever, and I will make your offspring as dust of the earth." Can't even count them. And he told him to rise and walk through the whole thing. Now, this time he doesn't talk about the blessing, but he does talking about the land and the seed. So I think it's fascinating, and just one paragraph, but I think a very important paragraph in Genesis chapter 13. Yeah. Well, we're going to continue on Genesis chapter 14, and this one, it has more names to mispronounce for me. I hope that people will give us a lot of grace as we dive into this next chapter, but there's also important lessons in Genesis chapter 14. Thank you so much for joining us in our podcast in Genesis as we plow through the book of Genesis, and right now we're right in the middle of Abraham.